This presentation introduces the art of the Greek period. We'll look at 3 periods of Greek art: the archaic, the classical, and the Hellenistic. But this era of Hellenic art is really considered the wellspring of so much of our Western art and culture that it's an important period for us to study and a good place for us to start. The first period we will look at is archaic, and that lasts from 600 to 480 BC. In the archaic period, artists move away from previously geometric forms. There is more representational art, showing people and animals. The feeling for three-dimensional space becomes more refined. And the way fabric is depicted becomes more realistic. In the introduction to this part of our course, I spoke about the ideas of continuity and transformation. We can see that already because although we're starting with Greek art, there were centuries of art preceding that, and the Greeks themselves acknowledged their debt to Egyptian arts for inspiration and ideas. Here you can see a somewhat similar shape to the pottery vessel, but you can also see the change, as we said in the last slide, away from strictly geometric forms. So the Egyptian pottery shows entirely abstract decoration. The archaic Greek vessel shows a representational scene. And this is a highly detailed depiction of an athletic event at the Pan-Athenaic Games. It was an event that was sort of like a cross between boxing and wrestling, and the only actions that were prohibited were biting and gouging the eyes. So it was a very harsh sport, and it was, this was the prize vessel to the person who won the Pan-Athenaic Games. In sculpture, we can look for some continuity in terms of the pose. You see the clenched fist and the left foot forward. But we can also see that these figures are quite rigid. Even the later archaic Greek statues are still quite rigid. The feet are apart, but the weight is equally placed between them. This is not a body that's actually in motion, because there's no sense of the transfer of weight or the natural relaxation in a body. However, we can see some transformation in that there's very little realistic musculature or detail in the Egyptian statue, and the archaic statues are placed there in chronological order. So the middle figure is still more stylized, but finally when we get to the figure on the right, there's much more realistic detail. These sculptures are called choros in the Greek tradition, and it just means young male, and they're often were made for funerary purposes, but they allow us to clearly see the progression through time, the way the portrayal of the human body changed over time. So now we're going to get to the classical era, and classicism is something that will come up throughout our course. The Renaissance was a time of classicism when people tried to go back to emulate the artistic ideals of classical antiquity. So we're going to look at those ideals and also some of the characteristics of classical art now. And it's very important to remember these because, as I said, the Romans, actually, the Renaissance, the neoclassical movements during the Enlightenment, many different periods of time, people believe in classicism, where they're going to try to reinvigorate these classical ideals. Classical Greece was a period from the 4th to the 5th century BC. It's often called the Golden Age of Greece, and it was centered in the city of Athens. During this time, Pericles was the ruler, and democracy was the form of government that was in place. Granted, it was a highly imperfect democracy. Women were excluded from the citizenry, and there were slaves. Foreigners could do business in Athens, but certainly were given a different status from those who were in the voting citizenry. However, the theory and ideals of democracy were certainly being developed at this time. Now, if we look at some of the elements of classical style, one of the most noticeable elements is a logical and carefully balanced composition. Greek thinkers pursued knowledge, and they sought to find order and pattern in the natural world as well as their own thoughts. There was a belief, a notion that mathematics, that numbers could be used to understand the principles operating through the universe. And this highly rational, knowledge-based approach to the world is reflected in the logical, symmetrical, balanced compositions of Greek art. Another element is idealization, and this too can be seen as a reflection of their worldview and actually, perhaps of their religious views as well. If you think about the Greek art that you've seen and that we'll see in this class, it is not concerned with the afterlife. It's not about heaven or hell or judgment day. It's about the ideal. In Plato's philosophy, there were three really important ideals that we should all be seeking, and those were truth, beauty, and goodness. But he felt that beauty was the most accessible of the three, the most visible. So, in a way, by this idea of idealizing the human form, it was a way of getting closer to perfection, getting closer to the ideal that Plato felt we should be seeking. There are a few other things that we can reflect on looking at these idealized figures. First of all, when we look at something like this is a warrior in this slide. And we're not really looking at a warrior, we're looking at the ideal warrior. It's not really based on a single person as much as trying to include all the perfection and idealism that the artist can achieve. And another thing to think about in regard to this is that it was a very deep instinct in Greek religion that they saw their gods as ideal humans. So there was not a strict hard and fast rule. An idealized nude figure could be the god Dionysus, or it could be a warrior, it could be an athlete, but the ideal itself was what they were after, and we can see that clearly in these sculptures. This slide shows us an example of contrapposto. So if you think back to the archaic Kouros sculptures that I showed you, where there was 1 foot ahead, but the weight had not been shifted, there was no natural relaxation in the body, we can see that during the classical era, sculptors achieved that natural shift of weight. There's a subtle set of curves here. Sometimes people describe it as an S curve. If you look at the turn of the head to the curve of the torso and then the curve of the leg, it's a much more realistic approach to a human stance. This particular sculpture is by Polykleitos. And Polykleitos remains known to us partly because he wrote a treatise or a book about the rules, the guidelines of sculpture. And that gives us a chance to talk about one of our themes, the role of the artist. So in ancient Greece, some of the works that remain, extant, were signed by the artist, but the majority of them weren't. It's different from something like Egypt or the Assyrian arts, where really those works were never signed. So Greek artists did sign their works. We know some of their names, but we also know that they were mainly seen as workers. They weren't particularly admired. In fact, one philosopher named Seneca is quoted as writing, "One venerates the divine images. One may pray and sacrifice to them, yet one despises the sculptors who made them." So clearly, though their work was admired, a sculptor was not someone of elevated importance or fame at this time. A few of them, Myron, Phidias, Praxiteles, these are names that come down to us from antiquity. Polyclitus is remembered for his treatise. However, it was not an elevated status at that time. And going along with that, it wasn't an elevated status, and it was not about the artist's individual expression. In fact, our third element of classical art is convention, the use of standard subjects and forms. So this slide shows a photograph of the Parthenon, and you can see its basic format is peripteral. In other words, it's a temple surrounded by a single row of columns. That's called peripteral, and that is the standard form for an Athenian temple. You can see the Doric columns, again, a standard convention. One thing to think about in terms of the architecture of this time is that even though the post and lintel structure that you see used here was in part necessitated by the materials they were using, it also actually matches with their philosophy, because a Christian church often is sky-reaching, heavenward, and the beliefs of the Christian religion have to do with heaven and the underworld. But you see this temple and you realize it's not really sky-reaching, and that's in harmony with its intention, which is to be a temple in this world. Another element of classical art is simplicity. There's just no excess ornamentation. Moderation and self-control are the characters that are portrayed by this classical era of Greek art. Now, that will begin to change as we move toward the Hellenistic period, but in the classical era, moderation and self-control are key. Going back to the idea of the conventional forms, here we have the three orders of columns, another example of convention. These were characterized usually, so the Doric being the simplest, the sturdiest, was often characterized as male, and it was typically used in the city of Athens. Then the Ionic column, which is more slender and graceful and has the gracefully carved capital, was characterized as being feminine. And then you see the Corinthian capital. The city of Corinth was known as having a culture that was this sort of luxurious, luxury-loving culture, and that too is reflected in the convention of the Corinthian order with its acanthus leaves and much more elaborate style. I had mentioned that the conventional form of a Greek temple is peripteral. One thing to think about in regard to that is that we tend to think of religious buildings nowadays as holding a congregation, a gathering of worshipers. That was truly not the purpose of a Greek temple. A Greek temple was the home of the god or the goddess to which it was dedicated. So in the case of the Parthenon, it was the temple of Athena. And when there were religious gatherings or processions, those would occur outside the temple, not within it. The scale is such that it's clear they were not housing a large congregation inside. The Parthenon is part of a complex called the Acropolis, and the Acropolis is built on a hill so that it was clearly visible, and it was the place from which Athena could serve her most important role, which was that of protecting the city or the state. And here you can get an idea of the floor plan of the Parthenon. So those dots around the perimeter are showing the columns, the peripteral columns. The words around the outside edge describe the sculptures that decorate the whole temple. So there is a great deal of relief sculpture, as well as some freestanding sculpture on the pediment. As I mentioned before, it was post and lintel construction, which means two columns with a lintel across them. And of course, that on that lintel was where many of the sculptures were placed. So we have a number of slides here to give you examples of those. The one on the left would be called relief, but the one on the right, the Dionysus, is a freestanding sculpture. This is a replica of what the statue of Athena may have looked like. So when the Parthenon was built, there would have been a large statue of Athena inside of the temple. That statue did not survive, but we know that it would have been a brightly painted representation of the goddess. Now here's a really interesting element of the Parthenon. It looks perfect. It looks like the pillars are perfectly straight and that they are spaced exactly evenly. But the Greeks were aware of some of the tendencies of the eye to distort that kind of perfection. So, for example, the columns swell slightly to the middle. They're about 7 inches wider at the middle than they are at the top or the bottom, because if they were actually straight, they would appear to taper towards the middle. Likewise, the columns appear to be equally spaced, but it's actually slightly adjusted so that the corner columns are not spaced exactly as the columns down the middle of each side are placed. And that increases the gracefulness of the appearance of the building. The pillars also tilt slightly inward so that they actually appear vertical. They're very, very careful mathematical calculations and awareness of the actual experience of looking at the building are reflected in these adjustments. And this slide just shows us that although the temple has been partly destroyed, this picture shows us what it would have looked like when it was built, including the colors. We know that the sculptures were probably brightly painted, as was the statue of Athena inside the building. It was actually largely intact until the 17th century, but then in 1687 was partly destroyed. And then further, we could say changes to the site happened when Lord Elgin looted the statues from the Parthenon, bringing them to the British. Well, I'm not sure he brought them to the British Museum, but bringing them to England, and they are now in the British Museum. And that is actually a matter of current contention. There's a lot of talk about putting them back in Athens somehow. So this is a little bit of review. We've already talked about what relief sculpture is, but it's designed to be seen from one direction only. High relief is quite 3D. The sculptures seem to emerge from the wall. And low relief is a little bit more like painting. It's closer to 2D, we might say. So here's a picture of the Battle of the Lapiths and the Centaurs, and this is what you might call high relief because the figures seem to be coming right out of the building. A little bit of background on this slide is that there's a legend that at a wedding feast, the centaurs had been invited, but they drank wine and became wild and were trying to fight and be violent and rape the women, and they just were completely out of control, and the Lapiths had to fight them. So over time, as this became part of the mythology, that battle came to represent the struggle between wild nature and knowing the right use of wine, tempered and moderate use of wine. Here's another slide from that same series of sculptures. So this is high relief. Now here's an example of low relief. These are the gods in council, and they're much more part of the background wall. Here's another example of low relief. And then this is from the pediment sculptures, and the pediment sculptures were actually freestanding. Here's another example of the freestanding sculptures. And now, if you have already watched the introductory presentation, you will perhaps recognize the pose of the first of these three goddesses in this freestanding sculpture. We're going to move on to the third era of Greek sculpture, the Hellenistic era. The main difference here is that there's increased realism and emotion. Less idealization, more realistic representation. And as you can see in the face here, real emotion. It's much more emotional era. This is Nike of Samothrace, and she is one of the most beautiful examples of the Hellenistic style. Truly a body in motion. She appears to have just alighted, and you can see the effect of wind on the fabric. Nike is the goddess of victory, and this is actually a military memorial commemorating a naval victory, but we can see the wind, we can see the motion, and it is meant to produce sort of an overwhelming response in us. It's an emotional work of art. This is the Venus de Milo. She is the goddess of love, and here we see idealized beauty, but also a much more natural presentation of motion, more natural drapery. In the first discussion, many of you chose this example to use in your post, and here we definitely see realism and suffering. It's a great example of the Hellenistic approach. We're going to talk very briefly about Greek theater, because it is really where our theater comes from. They used the genres of drama, comedy, and satire, melodrama, and tragicomedy. Some of those genres that we talked about didn't really exist in the Greek tradition. They used drama, comedy, and satire. The setup for Greek theater was a proscenium theater. So you have the orchestra in the center, and then the skena is the background structure. The next slide gives you an idea of just how popular this was in Greek times. It was a huge cultural event. Thousands of people would go to these events, and they had, in fact, idealized the acoustics of these auditoriums to such an extent that they could be heard back to the back rows without amplification, but they had acoustical refinements that worked to project voices. The characters in Greek theater always wore masks, and I think that's something that many of us are not aware of, so I think that's worth pointing out to you. It's a fascinating element, and if you've ever seen a production where they've used the masks, it really changes your perception of what's happening on stage. It's very almost spooky. They used broad gestures. It was not a subtle form of art. And of course, the Greek chorus was always there to comment on the action. turning to Greek music, I would love to be able to tell you in detail about Greek music, but unfortunately, there are only about 40 or so fragments of Greek notation. And the notation is somewhat vague. It's based on letters. And so even when we look at notation, we are, to some extent, making an educated guess about what it sounded like. There are ways in which it definitely continues to our age to influence our music. It was the Greeks who came up with modes, which is this series of pitches that make up the harmonic language for a piece, and our scales are very similar to their modes. They believed that music had a direct, visceral effect on a person, that music could heal, that music could strengthen, that music could spur people to action. It was seen as a part of life, a vital part of life. We know that they did not use a lot of harmony, that it was basically monophonic music. The kithara was one of their important instruments. It was like a plucked lyre type instrument. And another instrument that we know was used frequently is the aulos. It's a little bit like our oboe, but you can see it has two pipes attached to the double reed. There are, of course, a lot of texts for songs that we still have because there was singing in theater, and there are plays that exist. So we know, for example, that the words you see on these two slides were sung, but the notation, unfortunately, is incomplete. Now, you can use the address here to cut and paste into your browser now if you would like to listen to this song, or I have posted the music examples separately on the D2L site if you would rather listen to it after you've finished this presentation. And there's one other music example, the Song of Seikilos. And this is a neat example because it was inscribed on a gravestone all those thousands of years ago, yet we can still make an educated guess as to what it sounded like, because actually the complete notation exists because it was on a gravestone. So again, you can cut and paste this now if you'd like to watch it, or you can simply go to the D2L site and watch it separately. It's a beautiful song, very memorable. And the closing slide is just a few of the masks that would have been used in these theater productions, just to give you an idea of how distinctive an effect that would have if you were watching Greek theater.